I led a memorial service a couple of weeks ago for a woman named Beverly, and like in a lot of memorial services, we had a time where people could say a few words to remember that person. So Joyce stood up and she told about how Bev had been so kind to her. She had welcomed her into her home and treated her like one of the family, trusted her. It's a memory that you might hear in any memorial service anywhere, except the reason Joyce was there in Bev's home was to get high. Joyce remembered how Bev had welcomed her in, and then she'd pulled her into Bev's bedroom and kind of had this private conversation with her. Joyce, I want to make sure you know my husband is a retired cop. And Joyce is kind of like, well, what's this about? Like, is this some kind of setup? And Bev said, no, nothing like that. But I thought you might hear afterwards about that connection, and I just didn't want you to be all worried about it. So he's cool. It's all good. Joyce told this story during the service without a hint of apology or irony. It was lovely to her. She remembered how Bev had made her feel. She trusted me in her home, Joyce said. There are a lot of people who, if you went to their house to get high, they'd steal you blind. But Bev could look at me and she saw something different in me. Joyce said this, and around the room there were nods and kind of words of encouragement, a few tears, not one bit of criticism. It made me think back to a funeral I conducted 10 years ago in the small town church I served then for, I'll call him Maury. Maury wasn't a member of my church. He was the neighbor of a member. And he'd been a longtime leader in Kiwanis. A lot of people in town knew him. The church was pretty full. We had a remembering time in that service, too. And one of the kids got up and talked about his dad. And Mom was sitting there, this long-time marriage. She was sitting there kind of listening. And after that, a few members of the community told what they remembered. And then this woman got up, kind of tall and thin and attractive with long, loose hair and skinny jeans and a flannel shirt. And she came to the mic and she started talking about Maury and what kind of relationship they had. He had been kind to her. She lived across the back fence from where he lived, and she talked about how they went back and forth across that back fence, back and forth across that back fence. She talked fondly about this, how much affection she had for this great man. And I sat behind her from where the mic was with white-knuckled anxiety. And I know I wasn't the only one thinking, she's going to say they had an affair. Back then, that was nothing other than a supremely awkward moment. I didn't even think about it. I couldn't make room in myself for the possibility that this was a genuine, holy memory of a man who had been legitimately important in that woman's life. By the time I heard Joyce's story 2 weeks ago, I did have room for that truth. I can lament that Bev and Joyce met under those circumstances. I wish Bev had invited Joyce to come over and make Christmas cookies or something. I can hope for there being better, more wholesome, more life-giving stories between them. But the less wholesome and the more troublesome ones are true, too. And I don't want to overlook the holiness, the communion that happened in that memory that Joyce shared. I don't want to talk her out of seeing it that way, and I don't want to miss seeing it that way, too. What changed for me between those two experiences is nearly 8 years as serving as the pastor to a church inside a prison, the Iowa Women's Prison in Mitchellville, Iowa. That's where that memorial service happened, by the way. We're an actual church. To get that, you have to think people gathered in a room, not so much building that you are in control of. I'm appointed there the way United Methodist pastors are anywhere. I could talk all day about my experiences there and the compelling women I've met there, heartbreaking stories, also liberating stories. I could make you want to serve a prison congregation. But that's not actually the point of what I want to share with you. This is not a prison ministry talk. It's a talk about ministry everywhere that's going to be stronger, more real, more true to the gospel when the church outside the prison learns some of the things I've learned inside the prison. I want to share a bit of that with you. So here's one of the things I've learned. What if we could come to church and not hide parts of who we are? We know the hiding part. We've got that down pretty well. I mean, just think about the way you pull yourselves together to get to church. You get the kids dressed and fed and the diaper bag loaded, and you pile into the car. And whatever squabbling happens on the way there between the kids, or worse, between mom and dad, whatever tensions are happening as you come out of the car, you walk into the entry of the church with smiles on your face, looking like we're okay, we're respectable, we're in control, we belong here, right? One of the ways we see this is the prayer concerns that get talked about. Do you have a prayer list in your church? So take a minute with me. I want to just engage you in an interactive activity I'm going to call Okay to Say or Not. Are you ready? By this, I mean to suggest there are prayers that we can name out loud, and there are prayers that we are going to keep to ourselves. So just try this with me. Your daughter had a baby. Okay to say? Your daughter's baby is in the NICU. Okay to say? Yes. Your daughter's baby has fetal alcohol syndrome. Okay to say? Yes. Okay, a little bit less sure about that. You're going to have knee replacement surgery. Okay to say? Yes. You're going on dialysis. Okay to say? Yes. You're having liposuction to take care of not so much. You just got diagnosed with lupus. You just got diagnosed with cancer. 20 years ago, 30 years ago, it wouldn't have been okay to talk about that. Cancer's like the staple of church prayer lists right now, but it wasn't. It was a shameful disease years ago. You just got diagnosed with HIV. Okay to say? I see some nods. Do I see some not nods? I think HIV is like cancer was a while ago. It's easier now than it might have been. A lot of times it's not going to get shared. A couple more sets. You lost your job. Yes. Okay to say? Yes. You're just not engaged. You lost your job. Okay. Yes. All right. Your car just got repossessed. No. You are really clear about that. You're homeless. Does that make anybody sad to think there could be people sitting in our pews that are homeless and they don't think they can share that with us? Your brother just got arrested for public intoxication. Okay to say? You come into a new church and it just so happens that your sister is in prison. She's a sex offender. Okay to say? No. Your dad is in death row in Ohio. I've learned a lot about prayers at the prison. There's a woman I'll call Terry, who that last one is her prayer. Her dad was, I think he still is, on death row in Ohio. She says it every week. You hear real prayers there for the addict still suffering, for her own sobriety, for the action that DHS, the Department for Human Services, is taking to terminate her parental rights, and maybe tomorrow's the day when their worker is bringing her kids to say goodbye for what may be the last time ever. I didn't realize how trifling our prayers are in most of our churches until I heard the raw prayers of my sisters inside prison. The unfiltered prayers are amazing there. Connie, who's a charter member, says, "Here we know we're broken. We don't have anything to hide." If pressed, she would go on to say, "People outside, you don't want to look like you have any scars. You do, but you hide them." This is one of the first things I'd say I learned inside the prison, that the church is stronger when we don't have to hide our scars. It's stronger because we don't spend as much energy trying to act like everything is just A-okay. And it's stronger because we get to realize that the people in that room, in any room, I think, actually, when we meet as a church, there's a greater diversity of experience in that room than we let on, than we even recognize. Take, just as an example, domestic violence and sexual assault. Statistically, probably 1 in 4 women in this country are survivors of that kind of trauma. In any particular setting, that number is going to be different. In our prison, it's 90%. 90% of the people in prison, pretty much, men too almost, are survivors of that. That's another talk. It gets my dander up. In any particular setting, that number probably varies a bit. You have to know there are women, and men too. The number for men is like 1 in 6. So in any gathering, You've got a lot of people who carry this scar of domestic violence or sexual trauma. But in my experience with people in churches, that scar is almost completely hidden. Women and men who carry that scar, we don't know who they are. So that if somebody walks in today bleeding with that wound that just got inflicted or one that's been going on for a long time, who's wondering if this is a safe place to talk about it, they're not going to know if there's someone sitting just down the row who lived through that, is a survivor, might be able to be a resource for them. Most of that time, that connection is never going to get made. And that person's going to leave church wondering if church really is a place that has anything at all to offer for something that deep and heavy that goes to the core of their experience. This has happened, my friends, because we've let it be known in small and large ways across generations what can be talked about and what can't, who we want to be in church and who we don't. We have narrowed down what can be shared so that in most of our churches, the raw stuff stays hidden. We can spend our whole morning in worship and Sunday school and fellowship time and never really find that there's room for the pain, the worry, the hope that is deepest, closest to our hearts. The church is going to be stronger when we, and I mean we, people like us who are trying to be leaders, right? When we make it a place where we can bring our whole selves, can bring our messy parts along with what's beautiful and right about us. Another thing I learned in prison that I wish the church knew: love, relationship. It is always a surprise to me how little we know this. Jesus was asked at some point, like, what's the greatest commandment? He's asked, tell me the greatest commandment. He doesn't say one, he says two, right? He says first, love God, right, with all your heart and soul and mind and strength. And then he said, love your neighbor as you love yourself. So love. So that happens kind of early on. And then in his closing words to his disciples, at least according to the Gospel of John, I always kind of laugh when I get to this. He's had his Last Supper. He's headed for the garden and the rest and the cross. And he has this long discourse with his friends. And he says to them, among his last words, I'm going to give you a new commandment. And I read that and I get kind of excited. I think, oh, I'm ready, Jesus. Lay it on me. What do I need to know in this last minute as you're going to the cross? And then he says, do you remember? He says, love one another. And I think, love one another? What's new about that? You've been talking about that your whole ministry. When I went to the prison to be pastor of the church there, right away I got told what the rules were about what I could do for people. Mostly it was what I couldn't do. I couldn't give her money or a notebook or a pencil. I couldn't make a phone call on her behalf or pass a message to a family member or anyone else for that matter. I can't weigh in on parole decisions or serve as a reference, sorry. I can't serve as a reference when she's looking for a job. My whole bag of tricks that I used to reach for so quickly when someone would come to me, it's what I was taught actually in seminary. We were supposed to have a list of referral numbers that we would be ready with. If somebody came with whatever that was that they wanted to know, we could reach for that and we could help somebody out. I found myself inside the prison and that whole bag of tricks was gone. All I had was me. And wow, that didn't feel like very much. But I started listening. My first pastoral care conversation there was with a woman whose son had drowned in their backyard. She ended up in prison as a result of all those actions. All I could do was listen as she talked about this. And in countless conversations like that one, I discovered relationship, love, in a way that did feel entirely new. When you have nothing in your hands except you and time, you get to really listen. You get to notice where the rub is, where her voice breaks, where she goes from trying to get you to do something for her to beginning to share who she is. I didn't come to that with any real skill. A woman would walk in and I'm like, God, I don't know what to do with this. You're going to have to take it. And again, God did, still does. I've learned to ask, where do you see God in this? I almost always offer to pray with her. She almost always says yes. There's almost always tears, hers and mine. I've come to love women, sisters I never would have even noticed before. One tiny glimpse of that, Julie came back to prison after I'd known her in a previous day. She came to talk to me. She told me about the suicide pact that she had made with her boyfriend. They were going to take pills and guzzle Miller Lite, and they did. I looked Julie straight in the eye and I said, well, I guess I'm glad it was Miller Lite. And she looked back at me, getting what I meant, getting how glad I was that the pact had failed. I love her. And did I mention she's a sex offender? We don't always, we church people, ever get to know the Julies and the Joyces and the Bevs well enough to have that conversation. We come in range of somebody who, say, will admit that they've attempted suicide. We hear the first whiff of that story, and it feels unsettling and unnerving, and instead of sitting with that, we swing directly into planning a program that will deal with suicide. We ought to do a suicide awareness workshop and offer mental health first aid maybe, or volunteer for a suicide hotline, or is there something we could do to help the high school counselor do a program about teen suicide? We hear Joyce's story of how kind Bev was to her, inviting her to get high at her house, and we start thinking about, gosh, maybe we need a neighborhood watch program because I think Bev might have lived in my neighborhood. Or we ask our youth leaders to add a Just Say No module to their spring programming, or maybe we think, well, maybe we could get that woman, I didn't catch her name because I wasn't really paying attention, but maybe if she come and talk to the youth, she could scare them straight. Do you hear what's happening? We switch out of relationship mode into program mode. And pretty soon we're helping people we don't have any intention of knowing from a distance. In such a way that we good people, we can tell ourselves we're doing so much for those people who desperately need our help. And by gosh, they better be grateful about it. Never mind that if we're honest, we're not really sure we'd even want those people sitting next to us on Sunday morning. That's a clue, by the way, that it's time to rethink that program. It's no wonder that Jesus gave us that parting commandment that way. A new commandment I give to you, love one another. He said it because he knew us. Love was always going to be new to us, always. Something we'd better keep on practicing. So we've talked about coming to church with our whole selves. We talk about keeping relationship first rather than hiding behind programs. I want to give you one more thing that I've learned in prison that I wish our churches knew. Everyone is welcome. Our baptismal ritual refers to the church which Christ has opened to people of all ages, nations, and races. When I talk about that inside the prison, I do a lot of baptisms there. I tell them, I think those words, ages, nations, and races, are a stand-in for a whole lot of other categories that we could talk about. Economics and marital status and criminal history and sexual orientation and gender identity and whether you have kids or not, or whether you've lost your parental rights to your kids or not. We go on a long list. If we take those words seriously, and good grief, mustn't we not take them seriously? There's no room to keep anybody out of the church because of who they are, just because of that status. That includes the person who's just come out of prison. It includes sex offenders, my friends. The Jesus who ate with tax collectors and sinners, that Jesus would not have drawn the line in such a way as to exclude a person, even if they were on the sex offender registry. And we can't either. Now, here's the thing. If we're going to stand here with our arms wide open, if we're going to say anyone can come in here, there's a corollary to that we have to pay attention to. The only way we can maintain this is if we have good, healthy boundaries for the way people behave in our midst. So saying to a sex offender, come on in, is not the same as saying, come and work with our kids, right? Welcoming a sex offender means we have to take the time to set up some boundaries that keep everyone safe, just like you're probably not going to let anyone who's been in prison have anything to do with the offering, right? for the church's sake as well as for theirs, because they don't need people wondering, did she take something out of there, any more than the church does. I've learned in prison it's a helpful thing to be clear about what's expected. When we've thought ahead of time, like, what should we expect? We can communicate that in a matter-of-fact way, not as some big crisis, just, no, you're not allowed to disrupt worship with your loud talking, even if that's connected to your mental health issue that you're dealing with. We hope you'll come back another time, but for now, we're going to have you sit with LaTanya in the back. She's lovely. She'll wait with you until your ride comes. It's important that those expectations be fair and that we apply them consistently and not to exclude certain kinds of people, not a backhanded way of not keeping our arms open. But if a person is trying to follow Jesus, if someone's trying to come into community with us as a church, I don't care what's in their past, there ought to be room for them to be here. It's going to be some long, hard work, tearing down the walls that keep people out and then putting in place the healthy boundaries that will keep us safe with one another. But we are called to that work. God's work in the world includes not just people who are uncomplicated, as if anybody, even in this room, is uncomplicated, right? There's so much more I'd like to say to you. I hope you'll catch me on breaks or be in touch after this week. There's much more for us to talk about. I want to hear your stories too, but I want to leave you with one last story. A woman I'll call Lori sat down early in my ministry there to tell me about how she ended up in prison. She had been married, she lived far away, and then her marriage broke up, and she returned to her hometown back kind of in the center of Iowa. And she took up with this guy, and a little way into their relationship, she discovered that he was using meth. And she's like, oh no, that's a deal point. I'm not going to be with you if you're using meth. And so he stopped, which is pretty remarkable, actually. On the strength of her conviction on this point, he stopped and stayed away from meth. But about a year into that relationship, some things happened in his life, kind of went backwards, and he went to her and said, I can't do it anymore. I'm going back to it. And Lori said, in that moment, I looked around myself, and I realized I didn't know a single person who wasn't using meth. And I gave in, and I joined him. And ever since then, I've been trying to get back to my first high. She said this. I didn't know a single person who wasn't using meth, living in a town with thousands of people, dozens of churches, 2 United Methodist churches with, between them, hundreds of people. And I'm guessing if I went into those churches and I asked those people, they'd say, well, good grief, we don't know a single person who is using meth. If we, well-meaning, comfortable church people are going to begin to know and love women like Lori and Joyce and Bev and Julie and Connie and all the others and be part of more wholesome, more life-giving memories in their lives, we're going to have to open ourselves and our churches up to people and experiences that are more messy and raw and real than we generally have. And I predict that not too far down that path of relearning what love looks like, we're going to say not just, wow, this feels like what we were supposed to be doing all along. We're also going to find ourselves saying, wow, I didn't realize how much I'd been missing. May it be so. God bless you. Amen.